So we are here with Maryrose Coleman. She is also a sales representative that is a senior vice president at Sotheby's International Realty Canada, along with myself. Maryrose, your background is design build before you had moved to Muskoka, where you now own and run a luxury cottage rental company and are certainly extremely busy with lots and lots of sales. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Thanks so much, Lani. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's just so much going on, and we wanted to speak with a local expert and get a sense of what's happening really in Cottage Country. So why don't we just sort of jump into it? I wanted to hear from you maybe a little bit. Let's talk background. At the beginning of the pandemic, or maybe even just sort of leading up to it, how were you starting to feel the market? And then we'll dive in afterwards to where things are today.
Yeah, for sure. So Muskoka in particular has been with even pre-pandemic super low inventory levels. So a seller's market for quite some time, but not the kind of frenzied activity we saw over the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, it might take a bit of time to sell a recreational property, but it would sell. There were buyers. There's not, we're not making more waterfront. So there are not that many options, and there just wasn't a lot. People tend to, have cottages for generations up here. And so there just isn't a lot of inventory that comes onto the market each year. That said, what we did have going into the pandemic, and in the early days in March, when we were all just trying to figure out what this was going to mean for us, March 2020, we were thinking it was going to be a really slow year, and that we would have to really manage our business carefully. When in fact, what happened was we just got completely slammed with demand from buyers, people who were leaving the city, wanting to get themselves situated somewhere that felt safe. In the early pandemic climate, especially when we really didn't know what transmission, how transmission happened. So the sort of late spring, early summer, our market generally is spring, summer, fall, and then it tends to quiet down over the winter. So the early spring market just took off, and we had tons of buyers, not a lot of product to show them. And what we did have, we sold. So we went into I'm part of a team, Halloran Associates, and we work with buyers, absolutely, but we're known as a listing team. And we went into spring 2020 with 70 listings, and we sold all but 4 of them by August. It was just insane, the demand. And that continued, not quite in as frenzied way last summer, but there was still huge demand. People, again, because we couldn't travel, people wanted to have the opportunity to spend time with family and have a cottage experience. We saw that also on the rental side with the luxury rental company, Muskoka District Rentals, where anything we had available got booked because people couldn't travel outside of Ontario. So it was a really very hectic time. That's shifted now. People are traveling again, as we all see in our social media feeds. People are, or on the news. If you look at the images of Pearson Airport, so it's a little quieter now than it was, but there's still solid demand for well-priced, well-situated properties.
And that's of course what we want to be hearing, and I think that matters quite a bit. You touched on a few different interesting things there. Excuse me. So one of my favorite lines is that they're not making more land, and they're certainly not making more waterfront either. So I like that you sort of hit on that, because it's true. We definitely still have a supply side issue. Mm-hmm. It's pretty interesting, your sort of anecdotal story of selling through 66 of your 70 listings. I think that sort of speaks to how robust that market was, and just sort of how wild things were going.
Yeah.
Was that people that were officially moving out of the city, or what were you experiencing? This was really just families trying to have a vacation, a long-term investment?
It was both. Some companies early in the pandemic told their employees that they were not going to be coming back to the office for 2 years or more. And so I had a buyer client I worked with who worked for a quite well-known company. And that was his situation. He was a senior exec, and he was going to be able to work from wherever for the next couple of years. And so he was looking to buy a place where he and his family, they had 2 young girls, could potentially spend a year and enjoy a completely different kind of lifestyle. So, that was the one end of things. The other was people who had been thinking about buying and suddenly thought they were missing out. They'd been looking maybe for a year or two, and now suddenly the pressure really was intense to find something to get situated to be able to have summer together as a family. So it was a bit of both.
So that pressure was really twofold, right? It was people feeling as though the market was going up, but also the intense demand for rentals as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, with your company, Muskoka District Rentals, what have you found with, respect to the rental market? What happened and where is that going?
So demand was incredible. In 2020 and in 2021. It was also a complete roller coaster because short-term rentals got banned several times in the pandemic. And so we had like a whole season booked, and then we had to cancel everybody because we were no longer allowed to rent, and then we had to rebook everybody. And first year, when we were, I think it was like the first Thursday in June or something, that the premier announced that we could accept short-term rentals again. Literally, we booked a year's worth of rentals, like what it would take us ordinarily a year to book, in a 3.5 week period. And I don't know how my staff and I survived that, because it was just madness. There was so much going on. So that was literally people understanding that there were going to be limited opportunities. They had to act fast.
For sure.
And last summer, similarly, incredibly busy, but not as frenetic. And this summer is actually the slowest rental season we've seen. And I've been doing this for more than a decade.
Now that's interesting, because right now, in the city, what basically we've been talking about is how the demand for rentals is certainly soaring right now.
Yeah.
I'm surprised to hear you say that.
It's a very different market. So short-term versus long-term is one. City versus cottage is two. So I'm well aware of the surge in demand for long-term rentals in the city, and what might be driving that. What's driving, I think, the dramatic downturn in rental demand in cottage country is people are traveling again. And so they didn't book a cottage. They're not going. And these might even be people who ordinarily would book a cottage for a few weeks. Like I've got one client who usually takes a cottage for the whole summer. Mm-hmm. And I talked to him several times over the spring, and he was like, yeah, I might book something last minute, but right now I'm going to go to Europe. I've been trapped in Ontario for 2.5 years. I want out. So there's that. There's also there was I think, not unlike many markets, there was a real push for investors to jump into purchasing properties that they could short-term rent, because they were looking at the numbers, because the numbers are quite high. Like a rental in Muskoka is not an insignificant expense. You're not talking about something you're renting for $2,000 for a month. You're talking about maybe even $200,000, depending upon the property. And so that drew investors into our market in a way that we hadn't seen previously. Some of those people have now tried to get out. We had one client who I think probably didn't understand the short-term rental market. Their agent may not have been familiar with short-term rentals, and they came to me on the rental side. They'd already bought the property. They were renovating it. They wanted it rented. We weren't able to get rentals. They were surprised they didn't get any right away. They thought the minute they listed it, they would get rented. It doesn't quite work like that here. And they ended up being quite alarmed, I think. And we had a heart-to-heart, and I said, I think you're best to go back to your agent and sell the property, because if it's costing you this much to run it, it was $8,500 a month to run the property, and they had no income coming in. And they're used to doing long-term rental, different market entirely. So they ended up selling. Hopefully, I don't know because I wasn't their agent on the buy and sell side of things, but hopefully they ended up coming out of it without a loss.
You hope so.
But yeah, I don't know what they spent on their renovations, so I can't say exactly. But anyway, yeah, so it's been kind of a weird season. And then on the for sale side of things, not unlike in the city, it's been I started to track in the end of January that things were shifting. And I remember saying that to our team leader, Ross Halloran, that I wasn't sure what it was yet, but I was absolutely sure the market was changing, if not turning downward. And that became even more apparent by the early springtime, that we had definitely a shift, not, again, not unlike in the city. And I think not unlike in other markets. What we've got now is a kind of complicated situation where sellers are still locked into expectations of the past few years, where the market was, going up, and trying to chase that. And buyers who are going, well, the market seems to be shifting and maybe even coming down, so why don't we wait and see what happens? And so there's some interesting opportunities. It's definitely a great time to be a buyer, because there are some opportunities that weren't there last year or the year before. And there's definitely been some increase in listings, still way below kind of normal inventory, but we've seen an increase in listings.
And those listings, are those being driven by people that had made the move out there, you think? Are they coming back because it's this back to work, change in dynamic with the office structure? Or what are you experiencing?
No, I'm not. It's not that clear. I mean, some of it is people who had been planning to sell. They just were waiting for the right time. We've got one client who moved out west, and so that's why they're selling, because they've relocated.
Sure.
We've got another client that is selling a family property, which has been in her family for generations, and they rebuilt and then decided that it just made sense for them. It was too big a property, that they should, try to find something smaller. And yeah, so it's less about people who moved up and now are wanting to move back to the city. And it's more about, this just happens to be the period of time in the life cycle of the property with the owner that they're looking to divest.
And I mean, inherently, being that it's traditionally a second home, this is a luxury product. And we haven't really talked about the luxury market changing so dramatically. It's more so the entry level and, standard, whatever that means, property that's feeling the effects of some of these big rate changes and changes right now in the market. But being that it's a second property, is this not where people would more likely take money from? I'm surprised you haven't yet seen a huge influx of listings.
Yeah, it varies by market here. So, if we're looking at just Muskoka, there's less vulnerability here. People buy their properties for cash often. And, we're talking $8-10 million properties that people are paying cash for. So, they can borrow against that if they are cash strapped. Often it'll be their last line of defense. Obviously the first line would be the primary residence, their home, but the cottage is a place where families really have a chance to bond together and connect together in a way that they don't elsewhere. Like when you're at home with your family, kids are doing homework, mom and dad are maybe working, you're together, but it's not the same experience as when you get up to the cottage and you're out on the boat and you're tubing with the kids, and you're not on your phone, you're not on your computer, you're not working. The kids aren't doing schoolwork. Everybody's just having this really amazing opportunity to bond together and enjoy being outside and enjoy the beautiful environment of the cottage country. And so people will defend that. They'll try not to sell. The investors are the ones that we might see. And as I mentioned with that previous example, where I had a rental client that ended up selling, those people may divest. And we're seeing a bit of that for sure. And we're seeing a bit of maybe buyer remorse sales, where people bought last year and they didn't really understand what owning a cottage was all about, because it can be a lot of work, especially if you're trying to do it yourself and you're not hiring someone to sort of help you with the ongoing upkeep. And so we're seeing some sales in the lower price points that are, they bought it last year, they're trying to get out now. They're trying to get a little bit of a bump because there was a big bump last year. So they're trying to catch that before the market declines, if it does declines any further. So it's only down maybe,
trying to time
10% or something now. So
that makes sense. I mean, your story there is really similar to my experience. I think that cottaging is very much about family time and, the experience of just being together, waking up, having breakfast together, which is, a great experience to have if anybody is so lucky to do so. But you also said basically that there are some differences. So maybe we can touch on that. Anyone who's looking long-term and thinking about this as a strategy, if they are, sitting on capital and there are some people trying to sell, a bit more listings, what are we looking at in terms of, major differences between city living and buying in cottage country?
Yes, there are some pretty significant differences. So we touched a little bit on the rental market, and that's a factor for some buyers because they're looking to offset what can be quite significant costs of ownership for a cottage by generating some rental income. And so you really want to make sure you understand, or your agent understands, the rental potential of the property, if that's a consideration for you. The other things that are quite different is we don't have municipal services in the same way in cottage country for most properties that you would have in the city. So if you're buying a house in the city, you're not wondering about where you're going to deal with your garbage, or what a septic system is, or what's the source of water that you'll be drinking. Whereas in cottage country, those are really important factors. So, is your water coming from the lake? Is it being filtered? How is it being filtered? Has it been tested? Were there any concerns when it was tested? If it's a well, how old is the well? How deep is the well? What's the flow rate? Has the water been tested? Are there any concerns about the water? So drinking water, obviously a very important factor that we take for granted when we live in the city, but is just not the same when you're in cottage country. The whole issue of shore road allowance, which is a kind of an antiquated holdover, if you will, from when land was first parceled out in Ontario. There was an expectation that they might need to put roads in on the shore of a lot of the lakes in order to have access at a later date. And so you want to know whether or not there is a shore road allowance that is tied to the parcel, and has it been closed up, is the expression. So do you own it, or do you have to lease it from the government? So not huge factors, but important, particularly if you're looking at a property that would allow for a boathouse, for example. If you don't own your shore rent allowance, then you've got to deal with that in order to build a boathouse. If you want to buy a property and your fantasy is to have a beautiful boathouse with an upper apartment, you need to know what the requirements are. Is it permitted in the township that the property is in? Because not all townships permit boathouses anymore. Is there a restriction on the shoreline that you need in order to build a boathouse? In Muskoka, you need to have 200 feet of what they call straight line shoreline in order to put a one-story boathouse. If you want a two-story, you need 300 feet, and they're talking about increasing that. So there's a number of things that are quite unique to cottage country real estate, and it's very important that you work with someone who understands that.
I couldn't agree more. Honestly, there's lots of different people and many of my clients that own cottages, and I will refer them out because it's just not in my wheelhouse, and I don't think I'm bringing the same value. Whereas in the city, of course, I know the last thing sold for. I've got a sense of, why this one's worth more or worth less, or where to spend money, how not to, etc. And so I think this is it. It's about finding local experts and taking advantage of your expertise. So
the other thing I think that you've touched on a little bit is that I think it's expertise of the local area is important, but I think the global connection is still also important, and the being able to refer within Sotheby's International Realty, I think, is a really important piece of that. Because then, like, for example, I'm working right now with a with a Sotheby's agent from the Toronto office with clients that are important clients. And so he wants to stay connected through the process. And we do that, we collaborate. That's all communication ends up with a CC for the other agent. And I do a follow-up status report anytime requested, just because, you want to make sure that you're confidently referring to an agent who is going to take good care of your clients. And that's one of the key features, I think, of working with Sotheby's, in my opinion, is that we have such a high standard in terms of client care that when you refer to me or I refer to you, we have that expectation that we're going to be making sure we go above and beyond to take care of that client's needs and make sure they don't get caught like that unfortunate example I gave earlier of the people who bought a cottage and didn't understand the rental market and ended up selling it.
Yeah, I think is something that I tend to take for granted at this point, but it is amazing to know that you're dealing with somebody of a certain level of expertise. And yeah, you're right. It's not even handing off. It's really about navigating through the situation and bringing in more expertise really to assist with the situation.
Exactly.
Before I let you go, and thank you for everything, was there anything else that you thought maybe you could give us in terms of predictions, where you're expecting things to go? Maybe specifically talking Muskoka, but Cottage Country as a whole.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where we're going to end up, to be honest. I mean, don't we all wish we had a crystal ball? I didn't expect the crazy bump that we got at the beginning of COVID. As I mentioned earlier, we thought we might actually have a really slow year. So it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out in the next few months. There's still really strong demand, which is typical for our market at this time of year. There's still time to buy a cottage and get situated and enjoy some of the summer. That starts to slow down in about 2 weeks, because then you're looking at, August, and you're not going to likely close quickly enough to get in for the summer. You might maybe get in for Labor Day weekend. You'd definitely be here for September, which personally is my favorite time in Cottage Country. It's beautiful and it's quiet, and the evenings are cooler, and the leaves start to turn. It's really lovely. But I think we're going to see steady demand, but I think we're going to see a softening of prices.
Well said, and I think that makes lots of sense. Well, listen, thank you so much for everything and for sharing all that expertise, meeting with me this morning. And if anybody wanted to get in contact with you, I'm going to be sharing your contact information below. And hopefully you hear from a number of my clients as a result of this.
Fantastic. I'm happy to help if I can. And thank you so much for the interview. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Maryrose. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Okay.
Thanks, Lani.